Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's training on PIH project-based vouchers and tenant protection vouchers. This is Jeff Little. I'm here in the headquarters conference room at RECAP, and we are glad you were able to join us this morning. We want to thank Pat Burke for working on pulling this presentation together. I know people are really excited to get this information. And most importantly, I really want to thank our colleagues at PIH, Diane Thompson and Tara Radosevich, who are going to be providing the training today. Without any sort of further delay, we have a big deck of content to get to, so I'll turn it right over to Diane and we can dive in. Are there any logistics we should go over before we do that?
No, it's just the usual go-to meeting. I think everyone knows how to ask a question these days. So do you want to take questions throughout or at the end? Do you have a preference, Diane?
I think it's fine to take them throughout since it is so dense, you know. Yeah, it might be good to break it up that way.
Okay, perfect. So just raise your hand and we'll call on you when we see it pop up.
Yep. Okay.
Great.
Take it away, Diane.
Okay, great. So as Jeff said, my name is Diane Thompson. I am a Senior Housing Program Specialist in the Office of Public and Indian Housing, and I specifically work in the Office of Voucher Programs. And my duties mainly include the project-based programs that PIH is responsible for, which is the project-based voucher program, the moderate rehabilitation program, and I'm also responsible for housing conversion actions, which involve both tenant protection and enhanced vouchers, and I work pretty closely with the RAD staff on RAD policy as well as RAD technical assistance. So that's just a little background as far as I am concerned. But the first slide here that we'll see just gives you an overview of the background of the statutory authority for the project-based voucher program. Really, actually, we can work backwards. Section 504 of the Quality Housing and Work Responsibility Act that was authorized the project-based voucher program in 1998. And then there were significant amendments to the program by the 2001 HUD Appropriations Act. And finally, in 2008, there were also some pretty significant amendments by the Housing Economic Recovery Act that we refer to as HERA. And of course, all of this is authorized by Section 8013 of the United States Housing Act of 1937. So you'll see on some of the slides that we refer to the Act, and I am referring to Section 8013 of the U.S. Housing Act. So the project-based voucher program is not a separate program, but it's an optional program that the PHA has the discretion to operate. And it's not separately funded, but rather the PHA may use up to 20% of its Housing Choice Voucher Budget Authority to project-based vouchers. For RAD, the project-based voucher units are not subject to the 20% limitation. The statute provides that HUD, that provision of the RAD statute provides that provision of the Housing Act is waived for purposes of RAD. So there is no special funding, as I said. The exception is RAD, and it's not so much that there's special funding, but the funding is being used for a different purpose. So it's being converted, as you all know, the public housing funding is being converted to voucher funding, and the tenant protection vouchers or the enhanced vouchers that families would have received under Component 2 is being converted to voucher funding and being used for project-based. And there's also another PIH program, HUD-VAST. There is funding specifically available for that set aside. The voucher funding, as I said, it comes from the annual contributions contract between HUD and the PHA, and it's used for both the tenant-based and the project-based voucher programs. So the statute provides that there's a maximum amount of PBV assistance that can be used, as we said, which is 20% of budget authority. And I just want to pause for 1 second and say that the information that I'm providing, it applies to the project-based voucher program as it's operated by PHAs under their normal, the normal operating procedures, as opposed to RAD. Where there is a RAD exception or there's an alternative requirement or a waiver, I've noted it on the slide. So anything that I say otherwise applies to the PBV program, which also would apply to RAD, with the exception of those places where I've noted an exception. I should have said that up front, sorry. So before a PHA issues an RFP or makes a selection based on a previous competition, the PHA must submit to HUD the following things that are listed there on the slide. So under the normal PBV rules, there has to be either a form of a competition where the Housing Authority requests proposals from interested owners, or the PHA can select a project based on a previous state, local, federal housing or supportive services type program. As you know, for RAD, the selection requirements, owner selection requirements have been waived, but just for your information, in case there's anyone who also works on the regular program, there is a competition requirement. And in order to ensure that PHAs are not exceeding the maximum amount of project-based voucher assistance that can be, the maximum amount of assistance that can be project-based, we require that the PHA provide us with those bullet points there on the slide. The total amount of annual budget authority, the percentage of annual budget authority available to be project-based, and the total amount of annual budget authority that the PHA is planning to project-based pursuant to whatever the selection is that they're doing at that time, and the number of units that the budget authority will support. So here's my exception slide for RAD. For both components 1 and 2, the covered projects do not count against the maximum amount of assistance the PHA may utilize for the project-based voucher program. And then I just listed there for your reference the provisions of the Act and the regulation that is waived. And if you want additional guidance on the calculation of how we calculate the maximum amount of PBV assistance when a housing authority has a RAD program, then you can see PIH Notice 2015-5. It's very comprehensive and it's very complicated, so it's more than I wanted to get into here, but you certainly can refer to that notice. So under the project-based voucher program, the statute requires that the units must be consistent with the PHA plan. So our regulation requires that the PBV development must be a part of the PHA plan, and it must include the proposed number of units to be project-based, the general location of those units, and the project must be consistent with site and neighborhood standards, which we'll get into a little bit later, as well as the PHA policy on deconcentrating poverty and expanding housing and economic opportunities. And that's a statutory requirement for the PBV program. The PHA plan must include that information prior to implementing a PBV program. We've had situations where PHAs have not done that, and unfortunately their projects were not able to go forward. The main purpose of the PHA plan is to give the public notice so that they're able to comment on the programs that the PHA plans to implement. Under RAD, the conversion is considered a significant amendment to the PHA plan, and so there's some specific requirements that have to be met when there is a significant amendment, and mostly it's related to notice and comment, and those requirements are in Part 903. One thing I should have mentioned as well, I thought it was on this slide, but perhaps it's on another, is that that goal of deconcentrating poverty and expanding housing and economic opportunities that I mentioned on the previous slide, that has been waived for purposes of RAD. I think we get into that a little bit later. The administrative plan. Under the voucher program, the Housing Authority has to adopt a written administrative plan for their Housing Choice Voucher program. And it has to include project-based voucher policies if the PHA has a PBV program. Again, as you remember from one of the first slides, that it is a discretionary program, that it's within the PHA's discretion to operate PBV. The administrative plan has to state the policies for which the PHA has discretion to establish local policy. So we don't necessarily have regulations that govern every single aspect of the program, and where there are those voids, the PHA, they are allowed to establish local policy. The plan is a formal document that communicates to all interested parties the policy choices the PHA has made where federal regulations or laws do not direct the PHA's actions or decisions. The PHA must include in its administrative plan the following PBV policies prior to selecting units for project-based vouchers. They have to include procedures for selecting proposals, including how the PHA will solicit proposals. As I mentioned earlier, there can either be a request for proposals or the PHA can select based on a previous competition, but before they do so, it has to be in their administrative plan. That, of course, wouldn't apply, as I said, to RAD. They need to have that in there in case if they're going to operate a PBV program outside of RAD, but the requirement would not apply. The definition of substantial compliance with housing quality standards, which we'll get to a little later in the presentation. The standards for deconcentrating poverty and expanding housing and economic opportunities, which again, as I said, is a statutory goal of the PBV program, but has been waived for RAD. Policies for site selection and how policies will promote the project-based voucher goals. And any additional local requirements that promote partially assisted buildings. We'll get into this again later, where there's a requirement that not more than 25% of units in a project can be project-based. The PHA, however, can set local requirements that promote partially assisted buildings where perhaps their cap is lower than the 25% limitation for the regular PBV program. For RAD, we've established an alternative requirement, and the threshold is 50% of units that may be project-based in a particular project, and we'll get to that as well a little bit later. So the PHA must include in its administrative plan the following types of PBV policies. So if a housing authority decides to project-based units in a project where there are families located, the requirement is that not more than 25% of those units can be project-based under RAD, 50%, unless the families are receiving supportive services. So the PHA has to state in their administrative plan the type of supportive services to be offered to families and the extent to which services will be provided, the form and frequency of how the PHA will monitor that families are receiving the services. They also have to include waiting list selection policies, tenant screening by PHA, policies concerning families occupying wrong size or accessible units, and vacancy payments to owners. So a lot of these sort of sub-bullets we will get into in a little more depth as the presentation goes on, and we'll get into some of the exceptions for RAD. So under the project-based voucher program, there are 3 eligible types of housing. New construction, where the units obviously don't exist and are being newly constructed. Rehabilitation, where the projects do exist but need rehabilitation beyond minor repairs to get the units up to housing quality standards. And existing housing. And existing is units in an existing project that substantially comply with the housing quality standards for the program at the time of the selection or the RAD approval. And for RAD Component 2 projects, only existing housing units are eligible for conversion. From what I understand, they're not entertaining new construction or rehabilitation, or at least that has, if the owner is interested, it would have to be, I guess RECAP would have to review and make an exception. But from what I understand, only existing housing units are eligible for conversion for RAD Component 2 projects. So there's several ineligible types of housing under the project-based voucher program, and they're listed there. Shared housing is an ineligible housing type. That's where the owner lives in the project or in the house. It's generally in the situation where there's like a house, for example. The owner lives in the house with the assisted family, and that's permitted under the tenant-based program, and we have a way of prorating the housing assistance payment, but it's not permitted under the project-based voucher program for several reasons. Institutional housing, so any housing on the grounds of mental or penal institution is ineligible. Nursing homes or similar medical facilities are ineligible. Housing controlled by an educational institution like a dorm. Manufactured housing is not eligible. Transitional housing is not eligible. Home ownership units, and this is not so relevant to RAD, but for the regular PBV program, units for which construction or rehabilitation has commenced after proposal submission and prior to execution of an AHAB. Even though under Component 1 you can do new construction or rehab, there's no AHAB requirement. So it doesn't apply to RAD, but it does apply to the regular PBV program. And then, in addition, PHAs, they're not allowed to attach project-based assistance to certain subsidized units, and those units are listed there: public housing, other Section 8, including a unit where a family is receiving tenant-based voucher assistance, Section 236 assistance, Section 515 rental assistance payments, Section 202 or Section 811 projects, home tenant-based assistance, and other federal, state, or local government subsidies. So if it's duplicative, if there is, for example, a federal or state rental assistance program where the assistance is for the same purpose, then that would not be eligible for project-based voucher assistance. PHA-owned units. So for purposes of the project-based voucher program, PHAs, they are allowed to own units and attach project-based voucher assistance, and the definition for PBV is that the PHA or its officers, employees, or agents, or an entity that holds any such direct or indirect interest in the building, including but not limited to an interest as a title holder, lessee, stockholder, member of a general or limited partner, member of a limited liability corporation, or if a PHA, its officers, employees, or agents possess any of those interests in the building, then the PBV project or building is considered PHA-owned. So this is important for Component 1. PHAs, in most cases, or a large majority of the cases, they will own the project. If there are PHA owned units, HUD or an independent entity that is approved by HUD must determine that the PHA units were appropriately selected. That's in the case of the regular program. Selection is waived for RAD. The independent entity must inspect units for compliance with HQS, and they must conduct rent reasonableness and initial rent determinations prior to entering into a HAP contract. The PHA may only compensate the independent entity from administrative fees, including their administrative fee reserves. Under the voucher program, housing authorities receive administrative fees to operate the units, operate the program. So the PHA, they may only compensate from administrative fees and not from HAP reserves or operating reserves for the program. The term of the initial and renewal HAP contract has to be agreed upon by the independent entity. That's slightly different for Component 1, and we'll get to that a little bit later, but it does apply to Component 2. The independent entity may be the unit of general local government or HUD-approved independent entity. If the PHA is itself the unit of general local government or an agency of such government, then the independent entity must be a HUD-approved public or private entity. So the PHA is not able to be the independent entity if it is the unit of local general government. The entity in the PHA must possess an autonomous relationship. They may not be connected legally, financially, except for compensations for services performed by for PHA-owned units, or in any other manner that could cause either party to be improperly influenced by the other. And we go into a lot more detail on PHA-owned units in Notice 2015-5 as well, PIH notice. So if you want additional information beyond that in the presentation here, you can see that notice. This goes through the HUD approval of the independent entity, what the PHA must submit, and what the HUD field office will do. I won't go into all of that. We'll just move on. This is an important point. If the PHA plans to use different entities for different functions, the PHA must request approval for each entity it plans to use and identify the function that the entity will perform. So as I said previously, the PHA, the independent entity has to approve the initial rents, as well as conduct rent reasonableness and do HQS. However, the PHA may hire one entity to do rent-related services and may employ a different independent entity to perform HQS inspections. Let's see. I think we can go forward. You all can just read through that. It's a lot of detail. I just wanted to at least have it there for your reference.
I have a question. The approval for the independent agency, does that happen in the field or here?
In the field office.
Oh.
So the HUD Public Housing Field Office is responsible for the approval of the independent entity.
Okay.
Site selection standards. So this is where the goal of the PBV program comes in. The PHA administrative plan must state the PHA policy for selecting sites, and the PHA must select the site based on that policy. And the site must be consistent with deconcentrating poverty and expanding housing and economic opportunities. The regulation is at 983.57. It goes into a lot of detail on the different considerations that the PHA should make in determining their site selection procedure, their site selection policy. For example, one of them is if the neighborhood is undergoing significant revitalization. The poverty rate in the census tract is another, but those are listed in 983.57. The PHA must indicate in this administrative plan how that they will at least consider those factors and any other factors that they will consider in determining whether the site is appropriate for selection. So the site must be consistent with deconcentrating poverty and expanding housing and economic opportunities. As I stated, that is a statutory goal of the PBV program. There is a RAD waiver, and that is the statute and the regulations that is waived. The entire regulation is not waived, so pay particular attention to the subsections there of 983.57. For both component 1 and, I'm sorry, repeating it, it's really important, I guess, the waivers there. And then I just broke out for component 1, the PHA has to certify with submission of the annual plan or the significant amendment compliance with site selection requirements, and you'll find that in the RAD notice 2012-32 that was recently updated, revision 2. There has to be a front-end civil rights review in certain circumstances. Again, that's expounded upon in the notice. For component 2, even though we've waived that goal of the PBV program, we reserve the right to assess and consider the impact that the conversion would have on deconcentration of poverty and concentration of assistance when the number of assisted units would increase. So HUD reserves that right to look at that before approving the request for a conversion. Site and neighborhood standards. The location of the project has to meet site and neighborhood standards. And this is just an example, be adequate in size, exposure, and contour to accommodate the number and type of units proposed. It has to promote greater choice of housing opportunities and avoid undue concentration of assisted persons in areas containing a high proportion of low-income persons. We have separate site and neighborhood standards for existing projects. So there's specific requirements for new construction, and there's this, I believe it's new construction has its own, and then existing and rehab has its own site and neighborhood standards. Some of them, of course, overlap, but new construction is more it's more extensive and it deals a lot more with promoting the greater choice of housing. And for RAD, no, this actually applies to both RAD and the regular program. HUD may approve new construction in an area of minority concentration consistent with the regulatory requirements. So I didn't go into detail, but there are some requirements in the reg, and there's also some RAD-related requirements where HUD may approve new construction in an area of minority concentration if certain requirements are met. So this is the unit cap that I was referring to previously. Not more than 25% of dwelling units in a project may be assisted, and the definition of project is a single building, multiple contiguous buildings, or multiple buildings on contiguous parcels of land. And that is a statutory definition. So it can't be waived for the regular program, and it hasn't been waived for RAD, but that is the definition of project. The PHA, as I mentioned before, they can establish a lower unit cap on the number of units in a project that may be assisted. The RAD alternative requirement is that the 25% limitation is increased to 50%. So rather than 25, not more than 50% of the dwelling units in a project may be assisted for both RAD Component 1 and Component 2. And the alternative requirements are for Section 8013D of the Act and the related provisions in those regulations that are cited there. So there are exceptions to the unit cap. The exceptions are for single-family properties, which is defined as properties with 1 to 4 units, and accepted units in multifamily buildings made available for qualified families. And multifamily is just saying more than 4 units, not the Office of Multifamily. So qualifying families are elderly and or disabled families, families that are receiving supportive services, and just noting there the RAD exception. It's so for families receiving supportive services, as I mentioned previously, the family, at least one member of the qualifying family must receive supportive services, except there is an exception for RAD. I think, is it on the next slide? Yes, it is on the next slide. So let's just go down quickly while we're talking about this to that RAD alternative requirement bullet. So families living in units at the time of conversion, they must be offered services. So if a family declines the offer, the family may remain in the unit, but upon turnover, the statutory requirement applies and families must receive services in order for the unit to maintain an exception status. So if the family refuses to receive the services and they're living in the unit, this is upon turnover, then that unit cannot maintain its accepted status and it would be removed from the contract. Upon turnover, if the PHA is referring families to those accepted units, the families must agree to receive supportive services in accordance with the PHA's administrative plan. So the administrative plan has to include the services offered to families, and the PHA, they should consider the nature of the services and the extent to which the services will aid families in becoming self-sufficient. When they are developing the type of acceptable services. So it's not any type of service like, our reg doesn't go into detail. However, when we've been asked and we've provided policy guidance, we've indicated that the type of assistance or the type of services should be of a nature that it would assist families in becoming self-sufficient.
Diane, we have a written question.
Okay.
Asking, can you talk about scattered projects and how those fit in?
Sure. Actually, I have a slide that's going to talk about scattered projects, and I believe it's under the HAP provision. So we'll get there. So the PHA may only refer qualifying families for occupancy of accepted units, as I mentioned. So services do not have to be provided at or by the project, but must be approved by the PHA. And then here are some limitations. The PHA may not require participation in medical or disability-related services. And the only exception is if it's a drug or alcohol treatment program. In that case, current abusers, as a condition of living in the accepted unit, they could require that they receive the drug or alcohol treatment services. Participation in FSS or any other supportive service qualifies. So FSS is a public housing program. It's family self-sufficiency. Many PHAs have family self-sufficiency programs, and if the families are participating in FSS, then we would consider that unit accepted, that the family is receiving supportive service. Completion of the FSS contract of participation or the supportive services requirement. The unit continues to count as an accepted unit for as long as the family resides there. So we're not going to kick the family out if they're not receiving services, but they've completed their FSS contract or they've completed participation in whatever the supportive service requirement may have been. If the family fails without good cause to receive supportive services, the family must vacate the accepted unit within a reasonable time established by the PHA. The PHA must terminate assistance if the family doesn't vacate within a reasonable time. The unit must be removed from the HAP contract, or if the project is partially assisted, then the contract can be amended to substitute another unit, which we'll get into a little later, and the owner may terminate the lease. The owner is not required to terminate the lease, but the owner may terminate the lease at that point when the family is no longer receiving assistance. And again, I just have a little asterisk up there that this is only applicable to RAD units at the time of turnover. It's not applicable to families living in the units at the time of the RAD conversion, because the requirement has been altered that the families have to be offered supportive services but not receive. However, once the unit turns over, new tenants, the regular requirement is applicable to RAD tenants. Can we go back? So the PHA has to monitor the family's receipt of supportive services, so that's very important. And they're required to take appropriate action regarding families that fail to complete their supportive services requirement as those listed there above. And the PHA, that is their duty under the regulation for services, is that they are required to monitor that the families are in fact receiving them. Very important. So the unit cap exceptions also apply to elderly or disabled families. If an elderly or disabled family, if something has occurred, for example, a death or a long-term or permanent hospitalization or nursing care, the PHA can allow continued occupancy in that accepted unit, even if the elderly or the disabled family member is no longer residing in the unit. So we're not going to kick the family out. We're not going to require that the PHA kick the family out if the disabled member that qualifies for the accepted unit has died or, as I said, is in some type of long-term hospitalization situation. The family can continue to reside, but it is discretionary. It's within the PHA's discretion, but our regulations allow for that. Once the family vacates the unit, in order for that unit to continue as an accepted unit under the HAP contract, it must then be available to and occupied by another qualifying family, so an elderly or disabled family or a family receiving supportive services. So, as I mentioned earlier, there are 3 different types of eligible housing under the PBV program: new construction, rehab, and existing. So I'm going to focus on existing housing because under Component 2, as I said, only existing housing is eligible. And for Component 1, much of the kind of pre-construction, pre-rehab requirements don't apply. So I'm going to focus on existing housing. it's, as I mentioned earlier, it's housing that already exists on the proposal selection date and that substantially complies with housing quality standards. The PHA has to have a definition in their administrative plan of substantial compliance with HQS. So whatever the definition is, the definition has to encompass housing quality standards. The units have to substantially comply with HQS, not another standard. And for RAD units, they must meet these requirements at the time of RAD approval. For the regular program, it's at the time of proposal selection. Within a reasonable time after selection or RAD approval, the units must fully comply with housing quality standards. So the PHA has to do another inspection to ensure that the units fully comply with HQS. And they have to fully comply prior to the HAP contract. So for repairs that are needed to comply with HQS, the expectation is that they would be minor repairs in order for the PHA to select the project as existing housing. If the repairs rise to the level of development activity, then the Davis-Bacon labor standards may apply, and we'll get into that a little bit later. The HAP contract must be executed promptly after PHA selection of the owner's proposal or the RAD approval and PHA inspection of the units. Again, just that note that only existing housing eligible for RAD component 2. Environmental reviews. So for the project-based voucher program, the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, it applies to the program. The unit of general local government, county or state, is responsible for the federal environmental review. And that entity is referred to as the responsible entity under our regulations. The environmental reviews are required for existing rehabilitation and construction, so they're required for all types. An owner and its contractors may not acquire, dispose of, demolish, construct real property, or commit, including entering into an AHAP or a HAP. And an AHAP, for purposes of those that are interested in the PBV program outside of RAD as well, the AHAP is the agreement to enter into a housing assistance payment contract, and it's the document, the contract that is entered into between the owner and the PHA for new construction and for rehabilitation, and it basically defines the development of the units and the requirements that apply, including environmental, Davis-Bacon, Section 3, other requirements as well, but the AHAP is sort of the document that outlines the development of the units. Development also meaning rehabilitation of the units. So anyhow, so I'll just start again. So an owner, its contractors may, and its contractors may not acquire, dispose of, demolish, construct real property, or commit or expend program or local funds for PBV activities until one of the following has occurred. The environmental review has been completed, and HUD has approved the environmental certification and a request for release of funds. The responsible entity has determined that the project is exempt or categorically excluded and not subject to compliance with environmental laws, or HUD has performed an environmental review under Part 50 and has notified the PHA in writing of environmental approval of the site. And so one thing I want to note is that PBV assistance is not considered tenant-based assistance for purposes of determining whether the project-based voucher activity is categorically excluded under NEPA. So for the tenant-based program, tenant-based voucher assistance is categorically excluded under NEPA, but for project-based assistance, we've had situations where housing authorities have misunderstood and thought that because PBV is funded out of the tenant-based program, that PBV activity is also categorically excluded, and that is not correct. PBV assistance is not tenant-based and is not categorically excluded under NEPA. Subsidy layering reviews. So subsidy layering reviews are statutorily required. And as most of you probably know, the purpose is it prevents excessive public assistance for housing by combining or layering housing assistance payment subsidy under the PBV program with other governmental housing assistance from federal, state, or local agencies, including assistance such as tax concessions or tax credits. Subsidy layering requirements are not applicable to existing housing, but they are applicable to new construction and to rehab. The PHA may not enter into an AHAP or a HAP contract until HUD or an independent entity approved by HUD has conducted any required subsidy layering review and determined that PBV assistance is in accordance with HUD subsidy layering requirements. And a further subsidy layering review is not required if HUD's designee has conducted a review, which included a review of PBV assistance in accordance with HUD's PBV subsidy layering review guidelines. And the initial administrative guidelines that we published were in the July 9th, 2010 Federal Register. That notice, it was updated September 26, 2014. The update, it includes mixed finance projects under PIH's, under the Office of Public and Indian Housing, mixed finance projects. So the July 9th guidance is basically just restated in the September 26th guidance, but the September 26, 2014 is the most recent notice. The HAP contract, it must contain the owner's certification that the project has not received and will not receive any public assistance for acquisition, development, or operation of the housing unless disclosed in the subsidy layering review in accordance with HUD requirements. So the HAP contract actually contains that language, and by executing it, the owner is certifying to that. So I probably already went over this, that the AHAP is not applicable to RAD Component 1 or 2. It's required for new construction and rehabilitated units under the PBV program, and they must be developed in accordance with the terms of the AHAP. Labor standards. This is Davis-Bacon. 9 or more units require the payment of Davis-Bacon wages to laborers and mechanics that are employed in the development of the housing. The owner and the owner's contractors and subcontractors, they must comply with the Contract Work Hours and Safety Standards Act and all other applicable federal labor relations laws and regulations. The PHA must monitor compliance with Davis-Bacon labor standards, with Davis-Bacon and other federal labor standards. So labor standards in existing housing. This became a pretty important topic a few months ago, I guess actually probably in the winter. HUD issued a Federal Register notice on the applicability of Davis-Bacon labor requirements to projects selected as existing housing under the PBV program on March 9, 2015. So under the Davis-Bacon Act, Davis-Bacon prevailing wage rates are determined by the Department of Labor, and they apply to construction, including rehab contracts, in excess of just $2,000. Since the existing definition under the PBV program is somewhat broad, HUD issued the Federal Register notice to close the gap that created the potential for circumvention of Davis-Bacon requirements. Prior to the notice, the regulation didn't preclude work on existing projects that may fall within the scope of Davis-Bacon. Since existing housing is housing that exists, that substantially complies with HQS, the expectation was that there wouldn't be any major rehabilitation being performed, so Davis-Bacon was not really considered until RAD kind of brought to light the fact that there was a lot of projects that were being rehabilitated in an extensive form. So they were exceeding, of course, the $2,000 requirement there. And we issued a Federal Register notice to try to close the gap that created this potential either intentional or non-intentional circumvention of Davis-Bacon. So since under the instruction and the rehabilitation aspects of the PBV program, there is the AHAP, as I mentioned. And within the AHAP, the labor standards as well as Davis-Bacon, those requirements are stated within those contracts. And the owner is agreeing by executing the contract that they will comply, and the PHA monitors compliance during the AHAP phase. But for existing housing, since there is no AHAP, you go straight to HAP contract once the unit meet HQS. The owner, the notice, the Federal Register notice that was published, the owner, it requires that the owner still be required to comply with the labor standards if repair work is being performed within 18 months post-HAP, and if that repair work constitutes development of the housing. And the owner certifies that repair work on an existing housing project determined to be development activity, that it shall be in compliance with Davis-Bacon requirements. We actually have an addendum to the HAP contract that the owner has to sign concerning the certification regarding Davis-Bacon. Accepted the PHA to analyze the scope and the timing of the repair work to determine applicability of Davis-Bacon. So if you want further information, I don't think I have another slide, do I, on that one?
You do, yes.
I have another one? Okay.
Standard.
Oh, okay. Okay, I'll keep going. So here we go, the scope. The scope is basically the elements of the proposed work, the specific activities involved. The term development is defined in statute in relation to the public housing program in Davis-Bacon, but it's not defined in relation to Section 8. So HUD has determined that development encompasses work on a Section 8 project that is comparable to the scope of work that HUD has determined constitutes development of a public housing project. And there's more detail in that March 2015, March 9th, I believe it is, 2015 Federal Register notice. And whether the scope of work constitutes development is determined by the PHA. So development includes work that constitutes remodeling that alters the nature or type of housing units in a project-based voucher project, reconstruction, or substantial improvement in the quality or kind of original equipment and materials. It does not include replacement of equipment and materials rendered unsatisfactory because of normal wear and tear by items of substantially the same kind. So that's just a couple of points that are important for owners to keep in mind and for PHAs to be aware of as well. The timing, as I mentioned before, development work that's initiated on existing units within 18 months after the effective date of the HAP contract is considered development for purposes of Davis-Bacon applicability. And the addendum to the existing HAP contract reflects the applicability of Davis-Bacon wage rates in the development of existing housing and must be included with the HAP contract if applicable. Equal opportunity. The owner must comply with Section 3 of the U.S. Housing and Urban Development Act of 1968 and federal equal employment opportunity requirements of those executive orders there. Those are also applicable. And you'll find that in our regulation if you want more detail. It's also contained within the HAP contract itself. Okay, so I'm not really sure why I put this slide in this order, but nonetheless, it's kind of out of the blue, right? I think because we were talking about existing housing, so this is actually, it actually relates to existing housing. Yeah, but it says for all housing types. For all housing types, the PHA must examine the proposed site before the proposal selection date. And for RAD, the PHA must examine the site once the PHA accepts the offer to administer the RAD contract for RAD Component 2. For existing units, the PHA must inspect all units as promptly as reasonably possible after accepting the offer to administer the RAD contract. All the units must be determined to substantially comply with HQS in accordance with the PHA's administrative plan in order to qualify as existing housing, and the PHA may not execute the HAP contract for the units until they fully comply with HQS. So there is that pre-selection, selection in the regular PBV program. We refer to it as a pre-selection inspection. In RAD, obviously there's no selection, so the PHA, once the PHA is selected, the PHA must do that inspection promptly. So this is just housing quality standard inspections in general in the PBV program. They must be performed on each unit, which is different than the Uniform Physical Condition Standards. So that's important to keep in mind for those who are working with PBV conversions, is that the PHA has to perform HQS on each unit prior to initial occupancy and prior to execution of the HAP contract. Upon turnover, so whenever a tenant moves out of the unit, the PHA is required to perform HQS. And if requested by the family, so if there's some item that the owner is not repairing, or the PHA feels there, the tenant feels that there is some deficiency or life-threatening deficiency in the unit, then the PHA has to respond to the family's request for an HQS inspection. The PHA is not allowed to provide assistance until a unit fully complies with HUD's housing quality standards on any unit. So the PHA cannot, for existing especially, PHA is not allowed to provide, and it's actually it's a statutory requirement that housing quality, that HAP payments cannot be made on units until they are in compliance with HUD's inspection standards. And in the case of PBV, it would be housing quality standards. There are biennial inspections are conducted on 20% of the units in each building, a random sample of 20% of the units in each building. If 20% or more of the units inspected in the building fail the biennial inspection, then the PHA must inspect 100% of the contract units in the building. So this is after the initial inspection, after units have been placed under contract. Our program allows PHAs to do biennial inspections on a random sample. Some PHAs, they still do annual inspections and they still inspect all the units, but the regulation permits the PHA to do biennial and to do them on a random sample of 20% of the units in each building.
And Darian, we had a written question asking, could you clarify if this is for component 1 and 2 of RAD, these standards?
Yes. Housing quality standards apply to both component 1 and component 2 for RAD conversion. Yes.
Thank you.
Alternative inspections. We just recently, well, about a year ago, issued guidance on alternative inspections. So this is after the initial inspection. The PHA can rely on an inspection conducted for another housing assistance program to fulfill the biennial inspection requirement. So if there is home funds in the project, or if there's low-income housing tax credits, for example, and there are inspections done for those programs, as long as these inspections have been done within a 2-year period, the PHA can rely on those inspections. If they choose to do that, they have to amend their administrative plan to state that. They must certify to the field office that the standard provides the same or greater protection as HQS. I stated that twice. That's really important. They have to amend their administrative plan. They must also monitor the method to ensure that the changes don't weaken the housing quality standards. And if you want more information on that, you can see the June 25th, 2014 Federal Register notice for more detailed requirements. So all inspections, both pre and post selection, must be performed, this is for PHA-owned units, must be performed by an independent entity approved by HUD. In most cases, Component 2 probably wouldn't be PHA owned, but I'm sure there may be a case where there's a rent-sup or a RAP contract, RAP project that's owned by a PHA possibly? No? You don't think so? Okay. So then this would only apply to Component 1 as well as regular PBV, that if it's PHA owned, then an independent entity approved by HUD must do the inspections. At the family or briefing, the PHA must provide families with contact information for the independent entity and request that families contact the entity directly concerning HQS complaints. So we were talking about that in the context of just the regular, a regular PBV contract where it wasn't PHA owned, where the families would contact the PHA. In the case of a PHA owned unit, the families would contact the independent entity, and the PHA is responsible for providing that information to the family at the oral briefing. And the oral briefing is provided at the initial issuance of the assistance to the family. The housing authority calls each applicant that is receiving assistance and being offered a PBV unit, they call them in for a briefing on the program and explain several things, but this is one of the things that they would provide the families with at that time. Detailed guidance on PHA-owned inspections is contained in PIH Notice 2015-5. So the HAP contract. The purpose of the HAP contract is to provide housing assistance payments for eligible families. The PHA, the PHA must enter into a HAP contract with the owner. The HAP contract shall only cover a single project. So getting back to the question that was sent in, there is an exception for single-family scattered site projects. So if there are single-family scattered site projects, which is between 1 and 4 units, those units can be covered under one contract. Yes, I'm just reading to make sure I'm right. What was the context of the question? Do you recall?
I just wanted to talk more about scattered sites, and I think you hit it about how the HAP contracts are set up. Okay. So if you need more, the person who asked the question about scattered sites, just send in another question. But hopefully that answered the question. That the HAP contract, it only covers a single project, but the exception would be where there's single-family scattered site projects. So one contract could cover several scattered site projects if they're within, the same vicinity in their 1 to 4 units. They don't necessarily have to be on the same they don't have to be a part of the same project. The definition of project, which we talked about earlier, where it's a building, a single building, multifamily building, a building on contiguous parcels of land, that's applicable to multifamily projects, not single family. Okay, the HAP contract must be in the form prescribed by HUD. So we have a form, which I don't know the form number off the top of my head, but there is a form that's posted on HUD forms, and that's the only form that can be used. It can't modify it in any way. For RAD, there is a rider to that contract, and is that posted on your website? I believe so. That's on the RAD website, and that has to be included with the HAP contract, the PBV HAP contract. There's a rider for both Component 1 and Component 2, and there might be more than one rider for Component 1, I believe. Okay, HAP contract terms. So the initial term of the HAP contract, under the regular PBV program, it's discretionary. The PHA can enter into a contract for up to 15 years. So we have a lot of situations where PHAs, this is their first time administering PBV, or they don't want to tie up their voucher assistance for an extended period, where they may enter into a contract for less than 15 years. I've seen several contracts where PHAs enter into the contracts for 10 years. So
So it's discretionary under the regular program. But for RAD Component 1 and 2, there is a mandatory initial term. For Component 1, it's 20 years. And for Component 2, as a condition of participation in Component 2, it is for 15 years. So if a PHA decides, well, you know, I don't want to enter into PBV contracts for 15 years, well, then they would not be able to participate. It's a policy decision that for RAD Component 2, the condition of participation is that the PHA and the owner must enter into the contract for 15 years. For subsequent extensions, a PHA may agree to enter into an extension at the time of the initial HAP contract term. So, you know, in order to cover that low-income housing tax credit requirement that, you know, there be a long-term contract, many owners who have tax credits, they request an extension up front, and so it virtually turns into a 30-year contract, which I believe would satisfy the tax credit agency. Anytime before expiration of the contract, the PHA can enter into a subsequent extension. The subsequent extension can be for an additional term of up to 15 years, so it can't go beyond that. The PHA must determine that an extension is appropriate to continue providing affordable housing for low-income families, and that is a statutory requirement, so that determination has to be made prior to entering into a subsequent extension. A PHA may provide for multiple extensions. However, in no circumstance may such extensions exceed 15 years cumulatively. So, for example, a PHA may wish to enter into, you know, 3 5-year extensions as opposed to one 15-year contract extension, and that's fine. However they choose to do that, in no case may the extensions be for more than 15 years. For RAD Component 1, there is an alternative requirement. There is a mandatory contract renewal requirement. So upon expiration of the initial contract and each renewal contract, the PHA must offer and the project owner must accept renewal of the contract subject to the terms and conditions applicable at the time of renewal and the availability of appropriations each year for such renewal. And I should also say that any extension is always subject to the availability of appropriations as well. And the waiver that allows for this mandatory contract renewal is listed there, as well as the regulations that coincides with the statute. Contract amendments. So there are a couple of provisions that allow for contract amendments under the project-based voucher program. A housing authority can substitute a different unit with the same number of bedrooms in the same building for a previously covered contract unit. The PHA has to inspect the unit to determine that the unit that's being substituted does pass HQS, and they also have to determine rent reasonableness. So for RAD Component 1, there's this different concept. It's called floating units, and it's only in for certain projects, mixed income converting projects where the units are already floating within a project, and they're redeveloped with funding under either a Choice Neighborhoods implementation or a Hope 6 grant, or as part of a mixed finance project. Upon request of the voucher agency that will administer the covered project, HUD will allow PBV assistance to float among unoccupied units within the project having the same bedroom size. So it's kind of the same concept as substituting units, but there's these limitations. We would allow it for these particular type of projects for RAD Component 1. A unit to which assistance is floated must be comparable in condition to the unit it is replacing. That is, the unit must be of the same quality and amenities as the unit it is replacing. The assistance may float from a Section 504 accessible unit only to another Section 504 accessible unit that has the same bedroom size and accessibility features. And units that float are not specifically designated under the HAP contract. So this is the one thing that's different than the substitution of units. under the regular PBV program, the units are required to be designated under the HAP contract. And under RAD Component 1, the units that float are not specifically designated under the HAP contract. But so in order to effectuate that, there's a waiver of the provision that requires identification of the location of each contract unit. So instead, the contract must specify the number and type of units in the property that are designated as RAD units, including any accepted units. That is, and accepted units, remember again, are accepted from the unit cap, elderly, disabled, or families receiving or supportive services or being offered supportive services in the case of families living in RAD units upon conversion. So the contract must contain the same number and type of RAD units, including the same number and type of Section 504 accessible units. And floating units are subject to all the requirements of the RAD notice and the PBV regulations, including physical inspections, rent adjustments, and income mixing. And income mixing, again, that's the 25% limitation under the regular program, 50% limitation or unit cap under RAD. And the alternative requirements with respect to floating units, they do not apply to any non-RAD PBV units that are within the project. So we're going to take a few minutes, like 10 minutes? Okay, well, we're going to take a 10-minute break so people have a chance to kind of absorb, I guess, and or relax, grab something, some water, and we'll be back.
Okay, we're back. Hope everyone had a chance to stretch, grab some water or something, probably answer an email or two. So we're going to start on slide 52. We're still talking about the housing assistance payments contract, and now we're just going to get into continue with HAP contract amendments. We talked about substitution, and now we're talking about adding contract units. So under the regular PBV program, it's within the PHA's discretion to add additional units to the HAP contract, but it has to be done within 3 years from the date of the initial HAP contract. And the requirements, the statutory requirements, must be adhered to, so the addition of the units cannot cause the PHA to exceed the 20% limitation on the amount of budget authority that can be project-based, and not exceed the 25% unit cap in a building unless there are exception units initially identified under the HAP contract. Then the addition can include additional accepted units. So this is strictly the regular PBV program. Adding contract units is inapplicable to RAD, both Component 1 and Component 2. There is one small nuance with Component 2, but as far as Component 1 and the vast majority of Component 2 contracts, adding units is prohibited. And the reason being is because the statute for Component 2, for example, requires that the funding that is converted to project-based units is the tenant protection funding that would have otherwise been provided to eligible families. And there are several waivers that we've already talked about that apply to RAD units that would not apply to any additional units. So for those reasons, it has been opined by Program Council that units cannot be added to the RAD contract. The one nuance, and I don't want to get this wrong, but I'll just explain what I believe it is, and if there's someone that has more knowledge and wants to send in a correction or or anything, but it's a little complicated, but for RAD Component 2, so in some cases, as the transaction managers are aware, there's also a prepayment involved in the conversion. There is a rent sup or a wrap or even a mod rehab contract, but there's also a prepayment of the mortgage. So the prepayment may trigger preservation eligible status of the project, and that's a determination that's made by RECAP. So if the project is preservation eligible, then both the assisted and unassisted families are eligible for enhanced vouchers normally. If families are eligible for those vouchers, but they would not receive an assistance payment because their minimum rent that they would pay or their total tenant payment, it would equal or exceed the rent for the unit. So they wouldn't receive any subsidy, but yet they're still eligible for a voucher. And in most cases, this is going to be in the case of a moderate income family that would have been eligible for, well, I shouldn't say that. I guess it could be a low-income family because you have to be low-income to qualify for PBV. But they wouldn't be eligible for any assistance payment at the time of the conversion, but yet they are eligible for the program. We have used the requirement for enhanced vouchers, which requires that the PHA must maintain that assistance for those families for a 3-year period. They have to make that assistance available to those families for 3 years. So if the family's income, if it decreases or if the rent increases and a subsidy payment would kick in, then that family would be eligible for enhanced voucher assistance. So in the case of a RAD Component 2 conversion, where you have families that satisfy sort of that fact pattern,
then the housing authority would offer the family the voucher if their income decreases or the rent increases, and a subsidy payment would be made. And the family would then have the right to either take that voucher and leave the project. They can stay in that project with an enhanced voucher. And the one nuance that to this not amending or not adding units to the HAP contract is in that situation, if the PHA agrees, if the family agrees to relinquish their voucher and the owner agrees, unit could be added to the HAP contract. So that was a long explanation, and I hope that it wasn't too complicated. But that's really the only kind of nuance to the inability to add contract units to a RAD PBV contract. And then this is just more for component 1 in the regular PBV program. When there's a staged completion of units, so if units are completed in stages, then all the units have the same anniversary date, and it would be the date of the completion of the last stage, I believe. Yes. Did we skip one? No. Okay. So this is removal of a unit from a HAP contract. So under the regular PBV program, if the tenant rent equals the rent to the owner, that is, if their income has increased to a point where they're no longer receiving a subsidy and their total tenant payment equals the rent to the owner, then the unit is removed from the contract 180 days following the last housing assistance payment on behalf of the family. If the project is fully assisted, the PHA can reinstate that unit that's been removed after the ineligible family has vacated the property. But again, that's in the PHA's discretion. The PHA may. Our regs allow for it, but it's within their discretion. If the project is partially assisted, a PHA may substitute a different unit for the unit removed when the first eligible unit becomes available. So they can do both of those things to sort of get the contract back up to where it was before that unit that the family was living in was removed from the contract. For RAD Component 1, there is an alternative requirement, and we'll go to the next slide. So for existing income-eligible families residing in the converting project, where their total tenant payment equals or exceeds the gross rent, HUD has waived the requirement to remove the unit from the HAP contract post-conversion. And the waiver is of 24 CFR section 983.258. The waiver, it only applies to existing families, and the new normal PBV rules apply to all new families. Waiting list. Selection from the PHA's waiting list is statutorily required under the PBV program. The owner cannot maintain the waiting list. The owner can certainly refer families to the PHA, but the PHA is required to maintain the waiting list. The families must be selected in accordance with the PHA selection policies that are in their administrative plan. And then there are 3 different types of waiting lists. Since PHAs that administer the project-based voucher program, they also administer the regular tenant-based voucher program, they can use their general voucher program waiting list. They don't have to establish a separate PBV list. They can just use their regular voucher list. Or they can establish a project-based voucher list where they have a list for families that are interested in project-based units, and they only take applicants on the list that are interested in living in one of their project-based projects. Or they can have an individual project waiting list. So they can have project-specific waiting lists, but again, those project-specific waiting lists are still maintained by the PHA, not the project owner. If the PHA decides that they're going to have a separate PBV waiting list, either a program-wide list or either a project-specific list, the PHA is required to notify all the Housing Choice Voucher applicants on their voucher waiting list of the opportunity to apply to the newly established project-based voucher list or an individual project-specific waiting list. And in notice, is it on 2000? It's not. And I can't think of the notice at the moment. I know it was 2011, I think that's 54, but it was updated. But in that notice, we give like some general requirements for the PBV program, and we indicate how the PHA can notify the applicants. They don't necessarily have to do like a mass mailing, but they can notify them through postings, through internet postings or postings in the local library or in the post office, places where applicants may frequent. And I'm leaving out some of the suggestions, but it's in, I believe it's 2011-54, that guidance notice. And if you look that up, there's an update to it, and it's within that update. There are alternative requirements concerning the waiting list for RAD Component 1. And the alternative requirements have to do with establishing the initial waiting list. And I didn't repeat them here, but it's, you all probably are aware of them. They're in PIH Notice 2012-32. You can see that for more detail. But after the initial waiting list has been established, the PHA is required to administer its waiting list for the converted project in accordance with the regular voucher, project-based voucher program requirements. Participant selection. Eligible families. Except for voucher participants that are determined eligible at original admission to the voucher program, the PHA may only select families determined eligible for admission at commencement of PBV assistance. For RAD Component 2, families that are eligible for voucher assistance that would have otherwise received tenant protection or enhanced voucher assistance. Those are the eligible families for RAD Component 2. In-place families. In several projects, in all of these projects basically, there's going to be families that are already residing in the unit. And if they are eligible, they're placed at the top of the PHA's waiting list, and they're given an absolute preference, which means that they have preference over everyone else who has applied for assistance and has been placed on the waiting list. If the in-place family is not eligible for assistance, the unit shall not be selected for PBV assistance. So that unit can't be placed under the PBV contract. So that applies to the regular PBV program, and it applies to RAD Component 2. There is an exception for RAD Component 1. And I'm sorry, the exception doesn't relate to ineligible families, but it relates to the next bullet. If no HAP would be paid on behalf of an in-place family at commencement of HAP contract, and that family, that family would be eligible, obviously. The unit's not eligible to be placed under the HAP contract, but the exception is that for RAD Component 1, it allows the unit to be placed under the HAP contract if the current family's total tenant payment equals or exceeds the gross rent. So that unit, under the normal program and under Component 2, would not be eligible for assistance under the PBV contract under Component 1 because the rents are kind of artificially low. You're going to run into situations where the family's total tenant payment will equal or exceed the gross rent. So HUD has waived 983.53C, which allows that unit to be placed under the HAP contract, but only for those families that are residing in the unit at the time of conversion. When a family accepts an offer for PBV assistance or a family's assistance is converted under RAD, the PHA must do the following. They have to brief the family. They have to provide the family with written documentation on how the PHA determines the total tenant payment. And the family must sign a statement of family responsibility. And what that does is it provides the family obligations under the program. So the families are aware of their obligations and the consequences if they violate them. Leasing units. The owner selects from tenants referred by the PHA at both initial leasing and at turnover. For RAD, the owner selects at turnover because the families are already residing in the unit, and there's no displacement for component one conversions, and for component 2, it would be those families that are residing there that would otherwise be eligible for either a tenant protection voucher or an enhanced voucher. So the owner would only select at turnover as opposed to initial leasing. The owner must adopt a written tenant selection policy and must promptly notify in writing any rejected applicant of the grounds of for the rejection. The number of bedrooms for the family must be based on what's called the Housing Authority subsidy standards. So under the voucher program, the Housing Authority has to establish subsidy standards, which basically provide the number of bedrooms per, the number of individuals per sleeping/living area. So, for example, the PHA may have a subsidy standard where a family of 4 that they would provide a 2-bedroom unit because 2 persons can reside in each bedroom. It's a little more complicated than that because it does get into like the PHA taking into consideration if they're brother and sister, the ages of the siblings and so forth. But that's the main idea, is that subsidy standards that determines the number of bedrooms allowed for the particular family composition. And the owner must lease vacant contract units to, the owner must lease vacant contract units only to eligible families on the PHA's waiting list that are referred by the PHA.
Written question.
I think we have a question.
Can an owner's tenant selection policy establish income requirements consistent with tax credit rules? For example, can an owner choose to only select tenants from the tenants that are referred from the PHA that are at or below 60% of area median income?
That's a good question. I mean, I could say that this question has come up in the context of preferences for our office, whether or not a PHA can establish a preference for a family, for families that have an area that are at or below 60% of area median income. And the answer to that is no, because there is a targeting requirement under the project, under the voucher program, where PHAs are required to select 75% of the applicants must be extremely low income, and so a preference for the category described here and extremely low in the targeting requirement, that could conflict. So the question that has been asked of me in regard to a PHA establishing preferences, in regard to an owner that being part of its selection policy, I'm actually not sure. That's something I'd have to get back to the questioner on. So if we can just get their name and information. Yeah, I'll consult with some colleagues and get back to you. Okay, I think we were done with this slide. So the owner is responsible for tenant screening and selection of families to occupy the owner's units. The PHA may give the owner information about the family's tenancy history. The PHA may opt to screen tenants for family behavior or suitability for tenancy and may deny admission based on this screening. So this is for just the regular PBV program. There is an exception for component 1. At conversion, current households are not subject to rescreening, income eligibility, or income targeting. So that's for component 1 at conversion. For component 2, the PHA may not perform discretionary screening for families that are eligible for tenant-based tenant protection vouchers, that are being converted. And discretionary screening is screening that is not dictated by statute. There's certain requirements that mandatory screening requirements concerning criminal background and drug use, but there's also discretionary screening where the PHA can screen out families who, for example, may owe money to the PHA or may owe money to a neighboring PHA, or a family that has been abusive to PHA staff in the past, for example. Those are examples of discretionary screening. So a decision's been made that for component 1 and 2, that PHAs are not permitted to perform discretionary screening on initial occupants. So upon turnover, I believe that, yes, upon turnover where the PHA is selecting from the waiting list, and the PHA could, of course, apply their discretionary screening requirements. So for lease requirements, the tenant, of course, has to have legal capacity to sign a lease. The owner has to use a standard form of lease used for rental to non-assisted families. The lease must include HUD's project-based voucher tenancy addendum. In the tenancy addendum, it basically just provides, for example, the rent, the tenant's portion of the rent. It provides the obligations, some of the obligations required for the PBV program. But it's online, so you can certainly take a look at that. It's under the HUD form. So the initial term of the lease, it has to be for at least 1 year. That's actually a statutory requirement. The lease must provide for automatic renewal after the initial term of the lease. So the lease may provide either for automatic renewal for successive definite terms, like month to month or year to year, or for automatic indefinite extension of the lease term. And the only time the lease terminates is if the owner terminates it for good cause. The tenant terminates the lease. The owner and the tenant agree to terminate the lease. The PHA terminates the HAP contract. And the PHA can only terminate the HAP contract for cause. Won't get into that here. The PHA terminates assistance for the family. In those circumstances, the lease would terminate. So this is actually a new provision. In the previous slide as well is a new provision for the project-based voucher program, where it's required that the lease be renewed, and also that the owner does not have the ability to terminate without good cause. So I just said it. The owner cannot refuse to renew without good cause. And the lease may specify a maximum period of family absence from the unit that may be shorter than the maximum period permitted by PHA policy. This is kind of just out here. So I'll explain a little. So our regulations require that if the family is absent from the unit for a period of time as determined by the PHA, that family's assistance may be terminated, and the PHA's policy has to provide what that period of time is, and if there's any exceptions to that. For example, if the tenant is hospitalized or away because they're in, away for service, they're in the armed forces or something and they're away. So the PHA may have some exceptions to this policy, and they would all be stated in their admin plan. But what this allows is that the owner can actually establish in the lease a shorter period than the maximum period permitted by the PHA. Occupancy for wrong size unit. The family occupying a wrong size unit, or if they're occupying a unit with accessible features and they don't need those features, the PHA has to offer the family continued housing assistance in another unit. And the PHA policy they have to have a policy on continued housing assistance, which must be in their administrative plan. And it could include either project-based voucher assistance in the same project. It could include, it could be PBV assistance in a different project. It could be a tenant-based voucher or some other comparable form of assistance. But it has to be articulated in their administrative plan, the type of continued assistance that will be provided for a family occupying a wrong size unit.
If the PHA offers a housing choice voucher assistance, the PHA has to terminate the HAP for the wrong size or accessible unit at the expiration of the voucher term. So under the voucher program, under the regular tenant-based voucher program, vouchers have a term. So the PHA may issue a voucher to a family, and the initial term for the voucher is required to be at least 60 days. But some PHAs may issue it for 90 days. It's really discretionary, but the initial term has to be for at least 60 days. And the PHA can provide extensions to that term. So what this bullet is basically saying is that the PHA, if the family is living in a project-based voucher unit and it's the wrong size unit, that the PHA has to terminate the assistance for that unit at the expiration of whatever that voucher term is. So this is, of course, assuming that the form of assistance that the PHA has offered is voucher assistance. If the PHA offers another form of assistance and the family does not accept the offer or does not move out of the project-based voucher unit in a reasonable time as determined by the PHA, or both, the PHA has to terminate the family's assistance at the expiration of a reasonable period, and the PHA has to define what that reasonable period is in their administrative plan. So if the family is underhoused at the time of conversion, underhoused meaning that, if they're underhoused, then the family is permitted to continue to occupy the unit until an appropriate size unit becomes available in the covered project. I'm sorry, this is the slide that gives the exception for RAD. When an appropriate size unit becomes available, the family must move to the appropriate size unit within a reasonable time as determined by the PHA. And there's and the waiver is 24 CFR 983.259. Okay. So under the PBV program, one of the main features of the project-based voucher program that was implemented under, I believe it was HERA. Was it HERA? No, what's it? No, I think it was maybe the 2000. I'm sorry, I don't recall, but it was not a part of the initial authorization for PBV, but it was one of the amendments. I'm not recalling off the top of my head which one. And it required that HUD allow families to move with continued assistance after a 12-month period. So that was very different because under the predecessor to the project-based voucher program, the project-based certificate program, and also I think it was prior to, I believe it was the 2001 appropriations that actually made this change. So prior to that, families were not allowed to move. If they had project-based assistance, then their assistance was tied to that particular unit. And if they moved from that unit, then they would lose their assistance. However, the 2001 appropriations language, it modified or it amended the Housing Act for PBV, and it required that families be allowed to move after residing in a PBV unit for 12 months. The family has to give the owner advance written notice in accordance with the lease. And in these cases, the PHA has to offer the family available tenant-based rental assistance, either voucher assistance or comparable tenant-based assistance. If no voucher or other comparable assistance is available, the PHA has to provide the family with priority for the next available voucher or other comparable assistance. If the family terminates the assisted lease before the end of the year, then the family, they relinquish their right to continued tenant-based assistance. And there is an alternative provision for RAD Component 1, which I actually didn't prepare a slide on, but you can find it in the notice 2012-32. But basically what it does, it allows PHAs to provide 1 out of every 4 turnover vouchers to its regular waiting list. And it really only comes into play when a PHA has a very large, robust RAD program. And
what they're finding is that their turnover vouchers are going to families that are on the list for turnover vouchers that are living in project-based voucher projects. And they're unable to serve their regular tenant-based program. So in that circumstance, the PHA may provide a turnover voucher 1 out of every 4 to their tenant-based, to an applicant on their tenant-based waiting list. So there's more detail in PIH Notice 2012-32, the RAD Notice, Revision 2, on this exception or kind of alternative requirement for RAD Component 1. And it only applies, again, to, it wouldn't apply to regular PBV, but only to RAD, only in the case where the PHA has a RAD program, and the 1 out of every 4 only applies. The alternative requirement only applies in the case of RAD Component 1 conversion. Tenant rent to owner. The family, they pay the total tenant payment minus any utility allowance. That's the tenant rent to owner under the project-based voucher program. However, which is different than the Housing Choice Voucher Program, by the way, if there's any out there that deal with the Housing Choice Voucher Program. But RAD Component 1, if a tenant's monthly rent increases by more than the greater of 10% or $25 purely as a result of conversion, then the rent increase is phased in over a 3 or 5 year period. I'm sure you all are familiar with this. This has been in the notice now for since the original notice. The alternative requirements are to Section 3A1 of the Act, as well as 24 CFR 983.3, which is the definition of total tenant payment. And the PHA must create a policy setting the length of the phase-in period at 3 years, 5 years, or a combination depending on the circumstances. The rent to owner. So the rent to owner is the amount that the owner can collect for the unit, and it cannot exceed the lowest of an amount determined by the PHA, not to exceed 110% of the fair market rent, or any HUD-approved area exception payment standard that exceeds 110% of the SMR for the area, minus the utility allowance for tenant-paid utilities. This doesn't include, I said the rent for the unit, but the rent for the unit also includes the tenant payment. So this is the hat, basically. So the rent to owner can exceed the lowest of 110% of the SMR, the reasonable rent, or the rent requested by the owner. But I do want to talk just quickly about that exception there. So the HUD-approved area exception payment standard. So if the PHA has a HUD-approved exception payment standard, which could be above 110% for their regular voucher program, then the PHA would use whatever the exception payment standard is for that area in which the project is located as that first bullet there, as it would be the lowest of the exception payment standard, the reasonable rent, or the rent requested by the owner. And I'm just highlighting that because there's been some confusion as to what that means, and it has to be a HUD-approved area exception. So it's not a project-specific exception, but rather where the housing authority has come into HUD and said, hey, the cost of housing in this particular area it exceeds the fair market rent, and they've provided documentation and everything that's required under our regulation to show that in fact that is so, and then HUD approves that, well then that becomes the new FMR for that particular area. And if there's a RAD project, for example, or a PBV project that's in that area, then that HUD-approved area exception payment standard would serve as this first prong in this rent determination. So just wanted to clarify that because I have gotten quite a few questions. For RAD Component 1, there's the additional cap on rent to owner based on each project subsidy under the Public Housing Program, as I'm sure you all know. And this is for tax credit projects. So the rent to owner for tax credit projects that
meet the following requirements are determined differently. If units receive tax credits, they're located outside of a qualified census tract, so in a better neighborhood. There are comparable tax credit units in the project that do not receive any form of rental assistance, and the tax credit rent exceeds the fair market rent limitation for the unit size. So in that case, the rent-to-owner is the lowest of the tax credit rent minus any utility allowance for tenant-paid utilities, the reasonable rent, or the rent requested by the owner. So for tax credit units that are located outside of a qualified census tract that meet those other criteria, the rent is based on the lowest of, or it's determined based on the lowest of the tax credit rent minus any utility allowance for tenant-paid utilities, the reasonable rent, or the rent requested by the owner. For all other tax credit units, the rent is calculated in the same manner as it is for non-tax credit units. So it's the lowest of 110% of the FMR, reasonable rent, or rent requested by the owner. The PHA is not required to cap the rent at the tax credit rent if the voucher rent exceeds the tax credit rent. And procedures for calculating rent to owner apply to both initial rents and for subsequent rent adjustments. The rent to owner in the following subsidized projects may not exceed the subsidized rent, the basic rent. So in spite of what the PBV rent can be, if there is a project-based voucher unit in one of these subsidized projects that are listed here, then the rent cannot exceed the basic rent. Redetermination of rent. If there is a decrease in the rent to owner because the rent is no longer reasonable, for example, the rent to owner must be decreased. There's one exception, regardless of whether the owner requested the rent adjustment. So in this case, the PHA has to be familiar with and be actively, I guess, kind of looking at fair market rents and looking at rent reasonableness in the owner's rent to ensure that the rent remains reasonable. And if it does not, then the rent to owner must be decreased. If the PHA has elected within the HAP contract, however, to not reduce rents below the initial rent to owner, then the rent to owner shall not be reduced below the initial rent to owner for dwelling units under the initial HAP contract, except in those cases to correct errors in calculations, if additional housing assistance has been combined with PBV assistance after the execution of the initial HAP contract, and a rent decrease is required pursuant to the outcome of a subsidy layering review, or if a decrease in rent to owner is required based on changes in the allocation of responsibility for utilities between the owner and the tenant. So so this is a fairly new provision for the project-based voucher program, where the PHA does have the discretion to elect within the HAP contract not to reduce the rent below the initial rent to owner.
We have a question from the Office of Recap perspective. What should we remember or understand about these rent discussions? From a RAD perspective, so how does the rent limitations apply to RAD component 1 and component 2?
So for component 1, the rents are determined in the same manner with the exception of the additional cap that I mentioned previously, that there's also a cap based on the public housing subsidy that the project was receiving. For component 2, then these are all normal project-based voucher requirements, and these all apply to component 2 without any deviation that I can think of off the top of my head. I'm pretty sure there aren't any deviations for component 2 for rent amounts. The one thing and you all will have to refer to the notice, Section 3 of the notice, there is a discussion about the subsidized projects where the basic rent, for example, where there's an increase in the basic rent, but it's after the
execution of the PBV HAP contract. And our regulations do not allow for redetermination of rent more than annually. In that case, I believe there's been an exception made where the owner would have to request a waiver in order, and I'm not going to remember it all off the top of my head, but you all should refer to the notice. So there's one little nuance there in regards to redetermination of rent for Component 2, but otherwise, all of the requirements apply to RAD Component 2 and to RAD Component 1 with the exception of the additional rent cap. So for PHA-owned units, the rent-to-owner is determined by the HUD-approved independent entity. We mentioned that previously, but I just want to emphasize it in this section since we're talking about rent. And the independent entity, they have to redetermine rent as required. They submit a written notice regarding the redetermined rent to the PHA, and the PHA amends the contract to establish the redetermined rent. Rent reasonableness must be determined by the independent entity, and the independent entity must furnish a copy of the reasonable rent determination to the PHA and to the HUD field office where the project is located, and that's the public housing field office where the project is located. So this, you guys probably are familiar with this. This is just basically giving an explanation of the TTP, how we get there. 30% of the family's monthly adjusted income, 10% of the family's monthly income, welfare rent, minimum rent is the highest of those. And the PHA establishes the minimum rent in an amount not to exceed $50. The total tenant payment is the maximum amount the family can pay towards rent for the project-based voucher unit. And the housing assistance payment is the gross rent, which is the HAP plus any utility allowance, any utilities, minus the total tenant payment. That's what the PHA pays to the owner. Continuation of housing assistance payments. So HAP shall continue until the tenant rent equals the rent to owner, and the cessation of the HAP at such point doesn't affect the family's other rights under its lease. So the family can continue to reside there. However, assistance would not be paid. If income, rent, or other changes occur within 180 days of the last HAP payment, the assistance for the family would resume as long as the family, provides housing authority with that information and the PHA verifies it. The family's housing assistance can resume. After the 180-day period, however, the unit has to be removed from the HAP contract, and we talked about that earlier. And we talked about the RAD 1 exception as well. So I won't go through it again. For vacancies, the owner has to promptly notify the PHA of any vacancy or expected vacancy. The PHA must make every reasonable effort to promptly refer a sufficient number of families for the owner to fill the vacancies. It is the responsibility of both the PHA and the owner to make good faith efforts to minimize the likelihood and length of any vacancy. And if any contract units have been vacant for a period of 120 or more days since the owner's notice of vacancy, notwithstanding the good faith efforts, the PHA may give notice to the owner amending the HAP contract to reduce the number of contract units by subtracting the number of units that have been vacant for such period. PHAs may continue assistance for vacant units for up to 60 days, and it must be in accordance with PHA policy and the HAP contract. So even though the statute allows for vacancy payments up to 60 days, it's within the PHA's discretion. Some PHAs do not pay vacancy payments, or some PHAs limit them to 30 days, for example. The PHA determines, as I said, the amount of vacancy payment not to exceed the monthly rent to owner under the lease. And the PHA may only make the payment if the owner provides prompt written notice identifying the date the family moved out to the best of their knowledge, The owner certifies that the vacancy is not their fault and that the unit was vacant during the period for which the claim is being made. And the owner certifies that it has taken every reasonable action to minimize the likelihood and extent of the vacancy. And the owner submits a request for payment in the form and manner as required by the PHA. So I'm just going through this because this is a pretty big deal for owners, especially for Component 2 owners, that they understand the vacancy provisions and what's required of them, and that it's in the discretion of the PHA to pay them and for the period that they can be paid. Oh, we're done with PBV. Okay, so we're going to move on to tenant protection vouchers. How much time do we have?
25 minutes,
okay.
Including questions.
Including questions. So the slides on tenant protection vouchers are just basic, and so many of you may already be familiar with this, so we'll just move through them really fast so that we can get to any questions. So just before I dive in, just so you understand, and I know that you all do, but the connection between RAD and tenant protection vouchers, of course, is only in the context of Component 2. Component 1, the PHA is not entitled to request tenant protection vouchers as a result of the conversion. In like Demo Dispo, for example, a PHA can request tenant protection assistance, but in the case of RAD, they are not permitted to request tenant protection assistance. Component 2, the owner is converting assistance that the families would have otherwise received because of a housing conversion action. So in this case, in the case of RAD, it would be either a rent up, a RAP, or a mod rehab contract expiration or termination. And if an owner has a rent up, RAP, or mod rehab contract, and also a preservation eligible mortgage, where the families would have received enhanced vouchers if the owner prepaid that mortgage, then those units may also be eligible for conversion under RAD Component 2. So this is really just in the context of Component 2, but again, this is just more of a general overview. So housing conversion action is a term used to collectively describe an owner's decision to leave a HUD project-based subsidy program or an action taken against the owner by HUD, for example, a HUD enforcement action. In this chart, it just kind of lays out the different types of housing conversion actions, and I realized that there's a new one, which is transfer of assistance, 8BB transfers of assistance, so that you guys should just kind of jot that down on this page as well. But there's preservation prepayments or voluntary termination, where the owner prepays the mortgage or voluntarily terminates the mortgage. There's project-based Section 8 opt-outs, where the owner chooses to opt out of the contract by not renewing. There's property disposition, where HUD is selling the property at a foreclosure sale, so forth. You guys know this better than I. Or a HUD enforcement action, where HUD is either terminating the Section 8 HAP contract or not offering to renew the contract due to an owner's failure to comply with the terms of the contract. So HUD provides tenant-based housing choice voucher assistance to eligible families that are impacted by these housing conversion actions. And depending on the type of conversion actions, vouchers are going to either be enhanced or they're going to be regular. And our processing guidance is found in HUD PIH Notice 2001-41. It's a joint notice between the Assistant Secretaries for Housing and for PIH. And just so you all know, we are actually codifying the provisions of 2001-41. There is a proposed enhanced voucher rule. And we also plan to, once that rule is published, actually, it may be before the rule is published. We have some negotiation going on with OMB, but we plan to issue a revised processing notice as well. And then there's also guidance found in Housing Notice 2012-3 on housing conversion actions. So tenant protection vouchers are for most HUD enforcement actions for property disposition, expiration of a rent sub or a RAP contract that's not preservation eligible, and they're ordinary tenant-based vouchers.
So they're different than enhanced vouchers, which we'll get into. But for enhanced vouchers, you have an enhanced payment standard, a right to remain, a minimum rent requirement. But for the tenant protection vouchers, they're ordinary tenant-based vouchers. So you have you have a normal payment standard, no right to remain, and no minimum rent requirement. And the payment standard, that's the it's an amount set by the housing authority for the maximum amount that the PHA will pay for that unit, and it can be between 90 and 110% of the fair market rent, but it's always capped by rent reasonableness. So that's the payment standard. I was talking about it quickly. I just wanted to take a second to help you understand the concept of a payment standard in the voucher program. So for both regular and enhanced voucher assistance, it's tenant-based in nature. So it's generally not project-based, but in the case of Component 2, of course, we're converting that tenant-based assistance to project-based voucher assistance. So in the case of a prospective conversion, the family is actually not issued the tenant protection voucher. The assistance, the funding that would have been provided is converted to project-based voucher assistance. In the case of a retroactive conversion where the family already has the assistance, be it tenant-based or enhanced voucher, they have the assistance in hand and they have to consent to the retroactive conversion of that assistance as well as the PHA that's administering that assistance. Families are issued vouchers may elect to use the assistance in the project, or they can move. I stated that already. The PHA subsidy standards generally apply. Again, the subsidy standards is the number of family members that can occupy a bedroom. PHA screening, these are regular tenant-based rules. Under the conversion actions, the PHA can deny admission to the voucher program for any grounds allowed under the voucher program rules, which includes discretionary screening, but under RAD, for those families that are living in the units at the time of conversion, the PHA may not invoke discretionary screening. Enhanced vouchers. So enhanced vouchers are provided for preservation prepayments, and a determination is made by housing as to whether it's considered preservation eligible. Section 8 project-based opt-outs, enhanced vouchers are provided. And again, same as all the regular voucher rules apply, which actually is under 24 CFR Section 982, except that the tenant has the statutory right to remain in the unit after the conversion to market rents. They may exceed the PHA's, the rent may exceed the PHA's ordinary payment standard used for its regular housing choice voucher. So the gross rent would equal the enhanced payment standard, provided that it's reasonable. And there's a minimum rent requirement, which I think we'll get into on the next page. No, we get into right to remain first. So the family that receives an enhanced voucher has the right to remain in the project as long as the units are used for rental housing and are eligible for housing choice voucher assistance. The owner may not terminate the tenancy of a family that exercises its right to remain except for a serious or repeated lease violation or other good cause. So just in relation to RAD Component 2, this is going to come into effect where, for example, there's a project that is preservation eligible, and the families would be eligible for an enhanced voucher. And there's some housing choice voucher tenants that are already residing in the project. Those families are also eligible for enhanced voucher assistance that provides these sort of additional protections. That family can choose to either keep their housing choice voucher, they can accept an enhanced voucher and lease up with an enhanced voucher, or they can consent to relinquish that enhanced voucher and regular voucher and allow their unit to be converted under RAD Component 2. So that's where that kind of relates to RAD Component 2 conversions. So enhanced voucher special payment standard.
Under the Housing Choice Voucher Program, as I said, the PHA establishes the payment standard within a basic range, 90 to 110% of the FMR. A family that stays in the project, the payment standard used to calculate the voucher assistance payment is the gross rent for the unit, which is the rent to owner plus the utility allowance for tenant supplied utilities, and again, limited by rent reasonableness. Minimum rent for stayers. The law requires, which is Section 8T of the Housing Act, it requires that a family receiving enhanced voucher assistance has to pay no less than what they were paying on the date of the eligibility event. And the eligibility event is the expiration date of the project-based contract. For opt-outs for preservation prepayments, it's the effective date of the prepayment of the mortgage or the voluntary termination of the mortgage insurance. For preservation-eligible prepayments, I kind of alluded to this previously, both assisted and unassisted residents may be eligible for tenant-based assistance so long as they were residing in the project at the time of the eligibility event. So this is, again, relevant to RAD Component 2 when there is a prepayment that's determined to be preservation eligible, and there's also a rent stop or RAP or mod rehab contract. Those families that are receiving, would have otherwise received enhanced vouchers, those units can be converted provided that the families are eligible. And the one exception, as I mentioned, for HCV families already residing, where they have to agree to relinquish their voucher. In order to become income eligible, the resident must be either a low-income family, including a very low-income family, a moderate-income elderly or disabled family, or a moderate-income family residing in a low vacancy area. So this is only for preservation-eligible prepayment. For other just tenant protection actions or other type of housing conversion actions, the family has to be low income, including very low. And that's just some references there for enhanced vouchers, which I've mostly mentioned. 2008-12 deals with the policy on families that are overhoused. They're living in units that are too large, and the requirements to move to an appropriate sized unit. So I'll take any questions at this time.
No questions.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. No questions. So there's no questions, it seems. So if there's anything that you all think of at a later time and you want to send an email, you most certainly can. My email address is diane.a.thompson@hud.gov. Diane is just one N, D-I-A-N-E, .a.thompson@hud.gov. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane.
Thank you, Diane.
I can't believe they're ready.
And we're moving on to the organization of the Office of Housing. Yes.
Okay. Hi, this is Tara Radosevich. I'm in the Office of Public and Indian Housing. I actually work in what we call our front office, which is the Office of the Assistant Secretary is our former name, but as you guys probably know, we too have a PDAS in PIH. And it's so we are the Office of the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary now. Can you see that? Hopefully everybody can see the slides. Thank you. So I'm a special assistant in that office supporting our two leaders. Lourdes Castro Ramirez is our PDAS and Jameen Bryan is our GDAS. Lourdes came to us from the San Antonio Housing Authority. She was the executive director there. And Jameen, many of you may already know Jameen Bryan. She was formerly our CPO, our Chief Procurement Officer. She came to HUD from, she's had time in New York City at HBD, at Philadelphia Housing Authority, and more recently at HABC, the Housing Authority of Baltimore City. So this is probably hard to see on the screen. And for those of you that are new to HUD, we have major program offices and support offices. PIH, the Office of Public and Indian Housing, we're one of the major program offices. Organizationally, we're smaller than the Office of Housing, but in terms of HUD's budget, we make up about 60% of the budget, and I'll say more about that as we move on. So we are about 58% of HUD's total budget. The bulk of it really is all of the money for the Housing Choice Voucher Program and for our public housing program. For those of you that are very new, the Housing Choice Voucher Program, or HCV, those are vouchers that go directly to tenants, and they can take them out on the private market and rent housing from any landlord that meets our standards for housing quality. The public housing program, these are our public housing authority properties across the country. Most of this housing, a lot of it was built in the 60s and 70s, and they need to go through a lot of major work now to upgrade the facilities. But a lot of these are older housing projects, developments now. And they are, they're in the very rural areas, but we also have a high concentration of housing in the very urban areas as well. Our Native American programs, that's our Office of Native American Programs, is over $666 million. So we are a big chunk. So we have approximately 4,000 PHAs. So we have a mix out there. We have housing authorities that have both public housing and voucher programs, and then we have some that are strictly public housing, and then we have a smaller universe of those that are just the Housing Choice Voucher Program. The public housing authorities, you can see our numbers. There's just over 1 million public housing units, and there's just over 2 million vouchers currently leased. If you can back up for a second, I'm not quite ready with the vouchers. What's interesting about the voucher number is that it changes every month. So our housing authorities have a budget authority for vouchers, and it used to be they received, say, 100 vouchers for their program, but now that it's a budget authority and it's based on what they spent the prior year, the actual number of vouchers on the street are going to vary, and they're going to vary with, for example, the per unit cost, the time to lease up. It's actually a pretty complicated method of managing our housing authorities to look at their budget utilization and their leasing potential, and that work is largely done by our Office of Field Operations, and we'll talk about that later. So what's the impact of our programs? Housing stability. We house over 3 million families. Our statistics on elderly and disabled are probably similar to the Office of Housing. It's usually around 50% are elderly or disabled residents. We do a lot of work to help end homelessness, and we support CPD, the Office of Community Planning and Development. Our VASH program, the Veteran Administration Supportive Housing Program, we're just over 62,000. That program we consider largely very successful. It pairs up, if you are a veteran going through supportive services through a VA hospital, we have vouchers set aside for you to get stable housing if you're participating in the supportive housing services. And it's been very successful. We're really pleased. We have some localities that are able to report that there's effectively, they'll call it, let's see, functional zero for meeting homelessness, the needs of the homeless. And it's functional zero because the services available to serve those persons experiencing homelessness are adequate. We're never going to have no people that are homeless, but we can have services that support those that are. We do a lot to preserve our housing and contribute to neighborhood revitalization. We have grants. Folks may have heard of the Choice Neighborhoods grants. We have planning grants, implementation grants. The Choice program grew out of an older program called Hope 6, and Hope 6 was set aside for severely distressed public housing units. With RAD, which I'm sure you guys know a lot about, with RAD, our housing authorities have been able to leverage private capital and do modernization and rehab using those funds and not strictly relying on getting a Hope 6 or Choice grant. And then resident opportunity. So in the Office of Public Housing and in, to a lesser extent, the voucher program, we do a lot to help our residents access educational opportunities, job training, also to help them save money to, if they want to leave our program and become homeowners. These are all under the umbrella of our Family Self-Sufficiency Program. But we also have a Jobs Plus program, which is a little bit newer. And what's neat about the Jobs Plus program is that where we're targeting resources strictly to educational and employment opportunities, we're actually seeing some pretty decent results for those residents participating in Jobs Plus. So the voucher program, I said a little bit about it. Here are statistics. We do still have a high percentage of persons that are disabled or elderly and very low income. They are able to rent on the private market. They typically pay 30% of their income in rent and utilities, so we go through a pretty detailed process at intake to verify what their income is, see if they qualify, and then set the rent. The rent that's paid to the landlords is based on FMRs, the fair market rates, which I think housing also follows. Those are set by PDNR, the Office of Policy Development and Research. And essentially what a housing authority does is they stay within a certain percentage of the fair market rent. That's what's paid to the landlord, and then the tenant still pays the 30% of their income. They can move and keep their voucher. What's big about this, being able to move and keep your voucher, is that this is a major program to support mobility of our tenants. And mobility can be important in that it helps them access greater opportunities, greater neighborhoods of opportunity. You're not necessarily stuck with, if there's a housing development here, you have to stay there, you can take your voucher and move. We let them port. There's a lot of rules. It's called portability. There's a lot of rules around portability, how soon you can port, and how it works. We actually just released a new final rule, our portability rule, to try and ease the administrative burden on our housing authorities. We've had some gaps between the losing agency and the receiving agency, and this is going to get too far in the weeds for you guys, but porting, while we strongly support it here from Washington, in field application it can be more challenging, and what we wanted to do is remove some of those barriers so that we can allow our tenants to move, because that's an important foundation of the Housing Choice Voucher Program. So of this universe, we have about 2,400 housing authorities administering those. Now with the Housing Choice Voucher Program, we also have housing authorities that can project-base their vouchers, and a project-based voucher may be, say, in a mixed finance deal. There's going to be low-income housing tax credit, but there may also be a certain number of vouchers that are project-based, and that helps support the financing of the project. And that is acceptable. There's more rules around project-basing your vouchers. You already covered it. Wonderful.
Yes. Yes.
And I am not going to say any more because it looks like it's been thoroughly covered. That's wonderful. So our public housing investments, this is our OPHI. As I mentioned, the HOPE 6 and the Choice Grants and the self-sufficiency programs, they all fall under Office of Public Housing Investments. This is Dominique Glum, for those of you who met her in headquarters. This is her program. She's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for OPHI. Folks have also maybe met Ron Ashford, Mindy Turboff, some of the names of folks working in this program. And I talk a little bit about the Moving to Work program. This one, it's talked a lot about on the Hill and sometimes in the news, because this is a universe of agencies. I think it's just about 39 that some would say get to follow a different set of rules. But it's more of it started as a demonstration, and it was built on the notion that some of the public housing regulations that apply to our housing authorities actually make it harder for them to assist tenants in gaining self-sufficiency, makes it harder for them to do the work that they need to do, and they made the case that they could actually serve more residents under these certain flexibilities. We could test them out, and then if it works for the Moving to Work agencies, they could be picked up in some of our other programs, and we can help streamline or make their operations more efficient. And there have been some things that have come out of the Moving to Work program that have made it that we've transferred over to our regular housing authorities. You'll hear a lot about the Moving to Work program because there's a current proposal by the Senate to increase the number of agencies to, I think, either 200 or 300, which is at a capacity that made us all gulp. But it is a good program. We're happy to see it grow. We're not quite ready for 200 to 300 housing authorities in the Moving to Work program, but we're definitely ready to entertain that should it be decided by Congress.
How many do you have now?
39. Yeah, so to go to that scale and capacity. It's also, the other anomaly with Moving to Work program is that a lot of the grant management or housing authority management is done here in headquarters as opposed to the field. And the field offices are certainly involved, but anything that comes to their proposals for the upcoming year, their annual plan, their reporting is largely handled here in headquarters. Okay, we can switch. Native American programs. This is actually a really unique office here in HUD, and it serves a very, obviously, a very different client. This program is headed by Roger Boyd. He's Deputy Assistant Secretary for Native American programs. We have, I think, about 4 or 5 field offices for ONAP. We do a lot of, we do funding directly to the tribes. We are the largest provider of federal housing assistance to the tribes. We also are proposing, getting ahead of myself, but we're proposing a new Veterans Assistance Program through ONAP. Here's some great pictures from some of our field visits. You can, there we go. So we have the Indian Housing Block Grant Program, the Native Hawaiian Housing Block Grant Program, and Loan Guarantee Programs. The Loan Guarantee Programs help for home ownership, I think on Section 184. Here's just a little bit of snapshot of the amount of funding and the number of tribes we fund. So our programs under ONAP are building, doing development, and rehabbing housing as well. REAC. REAC is another unique office within HUD. It serves both PIH and housing. REAC, on our side for public housing, they do their annual scores for housing authorities for their physical inspections, their financial operations, their management operations. They issue the scores. They've been working on a really neat project with housing on the White House Inspection Initiative. This actually came out of an idea. Folks that have seen the OMB, it was a call from OMB several years ago, and they've still done it a few times to look for ways we could streamline the federal budget. And there was an idea that we had all these different types of federal housing following different inspection standards. And so there was a pilot initiative to try and standardize those inspections, and REAC is running that. One of the other things they're working on is the ability to have inspectors take pictures and upload them to a system. And then more broadly, we call it enterprise risk management. Enterprise risk management is it's a way of looking at our risk internally for our assets and our program needs. And so REAC's Chief Risk Officer, Wendell Connor, has been working with all of our individual sub-offices to assess what our programmatic risks are and what our mitigation efforts will be. Some other projects coming out of REAC. PIC is our very outdated but thankfully still functioning system. It's the Public Housing Information Center, and REAC is looking at a plan to replace it or enhance it using our own in-house programmers. So we're all excited to see what comes out the other end of that. UPCSV, that is looking at our UPCS, our Uniform Physical Characteristic, I'm going to mess it up. Those are our housing quality standards in public housing, but looking at standardizing the standards for public housing and the voucher program so that they are consistent. So that's UPCSV. And then we're looking to get all of PIH's data in the cloud. And in the cloud will make it easier for our agencies to do automatic updates to PIC. And so our systems will better reflect what's going on at their level as well, faster. So I mentioned the REAC Physical Inspection Alignment Program. That's aligning all the federal standards into one. I mentioned Choice Neighborhood Planning and Implementation Grants. I think we're going to be announcing some winners very soon in the Choice Neighborhood world. Self-sufficiency programs, a HIT RAD, well, you guys know RAD actually, I should say. This Juvenile Reentry Assistance Program, JRAP, this is a really new program. It has not been cleared yet, as far as I know. It has not been cleared yet to publish as a NOFA. And what's neat about this program is it looks at, for juvenile residents of public housing, getting them assistance, legal assistance to clear things that may be on their record that would prevent them from future employment. So if there's something that happened when they were very young, they can get legal assistance to go ahead and clear those records. They don't become barriers to future employment. And this is a joint program between HUD and the Department of Justice. Impact. I think this one I hit too. Over 3 million families ending homelessness. Yeah, this is a duplicate. All right, here's the next one. Our field operations. So this office within PIH, you can tell we've got 700 employees, 46 field offices. We are in most field offices. We have not gone through the transformation and do not plan to go through a transformation like multifamily housing did. Our customer base is a little bit different than housing. We have, our public housing authorities are all over the country and tiny nooks and crannies of the nation, and we need to be able to get to them quickly, and so we have not, and we do not plan to really redo our field operations to that extent, because we do need to serve our customers in the field. Our field operations, they do a great deal of work around not just regulatory compliance, but risk assessment. A risk assessment from the public housing perspective is looking at how they manage their federal funds, their executive compensation, whether they have some level of reserves, and whether they are leasing and managing operations. And that's this huge matrix that could be a whole other training session in and of itself that we do quarterly, the risk assessment. And the risk assessment, what we like so much about this is that we don't just look at their metrics, we also get the input from our field staff on what they know about the housing authority. So one thing that may be an issue at a housing authority that can't necessarily be measured by a REACT system would be, for example, if we know there's issues with the housing authority's governance, and a governance problem would be, say, with its board. So if the Board of Commissioners managing a housing authority, say, for example, they're not well trained, they're all new, there's somebody's daughter-in-law just got appointed to be the executive director, if there's conflicts of interest, things like that. Those are governance issues that may not get caught in our systems, but we can pick it up as part of our quarterly risk assessment. Actually, we go back. Let me do one last thing and catch my breath. In the field, too, we work directly with housing, CBD, and FHEO. Folks in housing will know that a lot of work goes into, say, for example, if multifamily property has prepaid their loan and we need to get vouchers for their tenants, there's a lot of coordination at the field level for that. And then they do the outreach and technical assistance to our agencies. Go ahead. Additional support offices. We have a Office of Policy Programs and Legislative Initiatives. They do the work of developing our rules and regulations and coordinating with the Office of General Counsel. They also do a lot about when we have a new rule, they do the rollout around it. They have a new Deputy Assistant Secretary. Of course, she's probably been there for about a year, Danielle Bastarak. And then we have other support offices in budget, grants management, procurement and contracting, and then our OPRMA's office. Our OPRMA's office is similar to Housing's operation office in that they do assistance with hiring and HR issues. And in my closing slide, just a neat picture of some of the work done under our CHOICE or HOPE6 program and what our housing authorities and housing developments used to look like and what they can look like with new funding and new emphasis on better design in the neighborhood. And this is my contact information. I apologize for my voice waning here. Is there a way to ask questions? Yeah. Great.
We have a question asking, is there a time frame for the possible PIC replacement?
There is a time frame. I don't know it off the top of my head, but my recollection is that it's within the next year. It's not a quick thing, and we're optimistic that it's not going to be completely, it's not going to look like a totally new system that we all have to relearn.
Great. Is there any other questions?
Yeah, you mentioned public housing in rural areas.
So we do have a lot of public housing in rural areas and smaller public housing authorities. I think it's almost like 60% of our agencies are small, less than 250 units. And it's not like there was really, when public housing started, my understanding was that it was local jurisdictions could get together and come into the program. It's not like there was this grand master plan for where do we need housing. And it's actually been one of our challenges in rural areas in that we have housing developments in places where maybe the population still isn't there, and the demographics have changed, and so we may have vacancy issues in some of those areas. No other questions? Everybody's hungry.
Yeah. Okay, if there are no other questions, we'll say thank you very much to Tara and again to Diane. And this wraps up our public housing training. Bye.